This will be a lot more on the Swedish context, but still we hope that we can discuss it from a Nordic perspective. And I will just start quickly by showing how homelessness has evolved in Sweden since 1993, when we made our first mapping of the homelessness population in Sweden. So it has increased a fair bit. And the situations you see there is similar to the ethos discussion. So situation 1 is rough sleepers, and situation 2, in rough sleepers, you can see here, that's actually living on the street. And this figure here is people in emergency shelters and the like. Situation 2 is if you're leaving an institution, but don't have a housing prepared within 3 months from leaving the institution. Situation 3 is the secondary housing market that I will tell you a bit more about. And situation 4 is if you live privately within a contract that is not very secure. So the main interesting thing here is actually the secondary housing market, because that's where half of the homelessness population in Sweden lives. And the challenge here is, if you look at the National Board of Housing, Building and Planning, less than 8% within a year can take over their second-hand contract and get a first-hand contract. That means that the different type of housing solutions lower down the staircase will grow. And also the amount of secondary housing social contracts also grows every year. Another point that I would like to make here, because it has connection to what we will discuss later on, is that we can see that the migrant population of the total homelessness figures has also increased, even though we have to be careful when we compare these data, because the definition in Sweden changed over the years. So you could say from 2011 and onwards, it's more similar than before. One of the projects that we will talk about during this session, connected with Tove's later projects, is the project called Scanian Homes. And this is an ongoing project, so we will not present a lot of result, but more some of the tendencies that we have seen so far. So apart from making a survey and also trying to map the movement of newly arrived migrants, we also made or doing case studies in different municipalities here in the south part of Sweden. We're trying to look at housing trajectories. That means how people move within different types of housing over the course of time. And we include in this study newly arrived migrants, because we had a new law here in Sweden from 2016 where the state could decide where newly arrived immigrants should be moved within the 290 municipalities that we have here in Sweden. And during the first 2 years of that assignment, the state funded the settlement. And after 2 years, the funding responsibility goes over to the municipality. The other one is more what we call regular homelessness, and that is traditional groups of homeless people, and also those homeless people that we also have discussed in the session before, that are actually homeless but are not defined as or included as homeless in the homelessness definitions. So a few points here before I let Tove come in, is that we often hear in the Swedish context that social services really want to say that they're not a housing agency. That means that they want to focus on traditional groups, or the groups that are seen as the core of the social services mission. And during the last years, so it's now up since the 90s, because of the difficulties on the housing markets, more and more groups of people have become clients to the social services that are not what they used to be before. And in the recent, from last year, a new type of categorization has emerged, especially in 2 municipalities, Malmö and Gothenburg, but also elsewhere. And even though this has been discussed previously when it comes to causes of homelessness, the distinction now is actually between structurally and socially homelessness, and then it's connected to who might be entitled for help. And when it comes to structurally homeless, they have been excluded from the social services in these municipalities and not seen as the core target group. Instead, the housing provision is a responsibility for the municipality. So here is a conflict between responsibilities, but also causes and effects for the groups that are defined as structurally homeless. And we can see that they tend to coincide very much with homeless immigrant families that have children, and they do not get any help, more or less, from the municipality except for acute needs. And in Gothenburg, they introduced a special program. Instead of a permanent program, it's a temporary special program, but it had a positive result that were 600 families in 2016, and more than 1,000 kids received a first-hand contract on the within the public housing company in Gothenburg. Quickly, the responsibilization issue from Scanian Home that Tove will also talk a lot more about is that you can see that when it comes to this excluded group, a lot more responsibility is put on the families themselves, and that the families should provide and make sure that the kids have somewhere to stay. The problem here is, though, a catch-22, because on the housing market, it's really difficult to get housing on your own. And most clients to the social services are supposed to search for available housing within the whole country. But the places where we have housing, we don't have work. That's normally the case. I just want to bring in these theoretical concepts on credit and blame from Charles Tilly, just as a discussion. And what you can see when it comes to credit and blame, that has a very historical trajectory within taking care of poor people in municipalities. So we want to take care of our own poor, not others. And that often creates sharp borders between different municipalities, different localities. But blame, when we blame the victim, we activate often sharper distinctions between being a worthy us and an unworthy them compared to credit. And when you look at blame as a theoretical concept, you can also see that within that idea of blaming, you can find judgments of outcome, agency, that a person has a possibility to act themselves, and the competence and responsibility. So very shortly here, the special study on emergency aid within the Scanian Home project was activated because there were new guidelines with a very sharp demarcation between the structurally and the socially homeless people. And the consequences is that for homeless families, they could get help week by week after a personal visit. Fortunately, what we've seen so far is that the kids are not moved around week by week to new types of acute housing, but they can most often stay in the same. But still, it's a very short-term and very difficult to plan and see what happens in the future. Another one that it's important here is also that it becomes, the idea is also to make it more cost-effective, even though we can see that still a lot of municipalities have to use very expensive housing solutions that are temporary instead of more long-term rental apartments. So this becomes very unpredictable with the relocation that you can move from hostels, for instance, or hotels to day apartments. Day apartments is a new thing here in this country, where you live in an ordinary apartment, but you rent it day by day. And as Tove will come into, the child perspective is really not demonstrated in the research so far.
Thank you, Marcus. Okay, so I'm going to move on. These are two studies that I have been involved in, or that I've actually conducted. So the first one is a study called A Place to Call Home, or a report rather, I would say, that I wrote on behalf of Save the Children a few years ago, and where we were trying to really bring in children's voices and a child perspective in the housing debate in Sweden. So for many, many years, we've talked about housing shortage, and we've talked about people not getting in, but we wanted then to also kind of explain how is this felt by the people who are actually affected. This made me so interested in kind of diving more into it that I started a doctoral, a PhD, which I have just finished, and it is published and it is available online. It's called A Vicious Circle of Silent Exclusion. And here I have followed the trajectory of 17 single mother families over a period of 2 years in the region of Stockholm to see from their perspective, what is it like not to have a home in Sweden? What is everyday life like, and what are their experiences of trying to get help? So my take here is really, so I'm not kind of departing from official categories or definitions. I'm departing from the experience. So that's a kind of difference. So over the period of time that these families, and these were families that had been with children, not having a permanent home for between 2 and 9 years. So for long periods of time, but kind of going in and out of what as researchers, we would describe as either kind of official or as hidden homelessness. But but they all kind of were in those categories that Marcus showed in the introduction from the ethos typology, so around homelessness and housing exclusion. So for the whole period of time, they were inadequately housed, or they were sometimes in different forms of emergencies. Oh, sorry, I was trying to change the, thank you. Just kind of building, I'm not going to go too much into I think it's good that Marcus did a kind of introduction to one of the key issues in Sweden, and it is that we have 290 municipalities, and our social services are, they're working from the Social Service Act, but the Social Service Act is a framework law, which is designed to give discretion to local authorities and also to social workers, the intention originally being that would allow them to meet kind of local and individual needs. But already about 15 years ago, it was identified in a public inquiry that there was a problem with evictions and homelessness among families in Sweden. But the inquiry concluded that the problem was not necessarily situated in the Social Service Act itself, but rather in the implementation of the law, the organizations of methods used by social services, and also the situation on the local housing market, a lack of recognition of the nature of the problem, and varied local interest in improving the situation through existing housing policy instruments. And I think this kind of summarizes really well what is still the problem in Sweden. And since then, so for the past 15 years, this is a problem that I would say has accelerated. It's become much more acute, and we are seeing more and more families that are living under very insecure conditions. You can change the slide. So some of the contradictory roles of social services, so if we try to kind of understand how does this come about, it is that they, on the one hand, they have a role of child safeguarding. They are supposed to look out for the best interest of the child. They are also supposed to ensure a reasonable standard of living for the local residents in their municipality. At the same time as they, especially within the social assistance scheme, they are also tasked with that they should ensure that clients become self-sufficient. They should get back into work, or they should, move towards the labor market. They have to safeguard budgets. The budget, or everything that is paid for here, comes from municipal budgets. And then within this, they also then have to assess who is deserving and who is undeserving of support, or who's worthy and unworthy. So again, kind of what Marcus was talking about before. And what we can see, what I write a lot about in my research, and which I know also Marcus and his colleagues are kind of highlighting, it is this conflict between individual responsibility and the best interest of the child, which is inherent in the way that the social assistance scheme is constructed, because it is really kind of targeting the adult. You can swap again. So in again, very briefly, my study is 300 pages, and I'm trying to summarize a few bits here. But a few of the forthcoming methods or measures, so from the accounts of the mothers, so kind of looking at social service records, but also talking to them and them describing their interactions with social services, the kind of methods or measures that were forthcoming was, rather than being focused on prevention or some kind of housing path, it was very much about keeping out, so gatekeeping. People couldn't really get access to help because they were already stopped before they were able to apply for help. Control, so activation measures. So the similar kind of measures that we see in welfare to work policies, where you're supposed to apply for X amount of jobs. This was in many of the municipalities in Stockholm, or districts of the city of Stockholm. They apply that also to homeless families. So they had to apply for X amount of flats and show that they had done that. They had to do it, the majority of them had to do it all over Sweden. And if they were judged not to have done enough, which was at the discretion of the social service location, because this is, there's no kind of national guidelines around this, they could be sanctioned. So there were several of my informants that were sanctioned during the course of my research, and with 5 days notice, they were basically put in the street by social services. Because they were not seen as having made enough effort or taking enough individual responsibility for their situation. So there was a lot of kind of focus on exit, so exiting the social assistance scheme, and I would describe that as a focus on any housing rather than adequate housing. So anything was seen as going, so to speak. You can swap. And really, so there was this kind of clear demarcation between deserving and undeserving, although it would also kind of swap over time, and depending on, were you on maternity leave, are you working, so all these kind of different situations would then also play a role in whether somebody was seen as deserving or undeserving of support. But support could also look a little bit different. So if you were kind of allowed entry into the social service system, as Marcus was saying, a lot of it was temporary accommodation. And that temporary accommodation could last between one night and several years. So again, no kind of consistency in approach. Or it could be a social contract, which Marcus also explained before what that is. Often there is an idea that the intention is that the client should take over this contract, but in my findings, actually none of the families were offered that opportunity. But they stayed on a social contract for maybe 1 or 2 years, and then it was removed, and some of them became homeless again after this intervention. So there's no kind of trajectory or housing path that I could see. And then if somebody was seen as not worthy of help or underserving, very frequently they were referred to social networks without really any assessments of what these social networks might look like, or if there were actually people available or willing to accommodate this family, or they ended up in what I describe as an informal or parallel housing market, which is very much reliant on altruism or exploitation. And that can be as a lodger, so you will have families renting a room from another family, sublet contracts on the illegal letting market, etc., etc. And this needs to be seen in relationship to the Swedish housing. It's very complex, but these are some of the kind of things that we are noticing really. Marcus, you can. So just to share some of what some of the people that I interviewed said. Basically, all of them thought that the rules were not clear. They didn't really understand how social services were working or how they were making their judgments. This woman, obviously, she didn't think that they were helpful, and she basically said, you're supposed to be here for me and others. The only thing that you say is that you have to work. So there was a lot of focus on employment, but without taking into consideration the relationship between employment and housing. So, what comes first? According to these mothers, housing comes first. Although a few of them were working during the period that I was interviewing them, but their greatest fear was that if my housing situation becomes so bad that I can't maintain this, or if I end up living too far away from my workplace, this is impossible to maintain, basically. Next. And this is a description, and this is unfortunately not an unusual description in my data, where a mother is describing, she's saying, I was sitting in the reception and a woman came up to me and asked, what is your name? Why are you sitting here? So this is at the social service location. I told her I'm homeless and my children are unwell. And she says, we have no housing for you, but you can sit here and rest if you want. I was sitting until 3 p.m. Then a woman I spoke to the day before called me on my mobile and she said, I heard that you're sitting in the reception with your children. And she's then responding, yes. And she says that we close at 4 o'clock, and if you and your children are still there, the security guards will throw you out. And she's then kind of trying to find somewhere to stay overnight, which ends up being in a city 2 hours away with her auntie. And this kind of descriptions of security guards being removing families from social service locations was not unusual in this material. Yes, Marcus. So what is the impact on the children? From the mother's point of view, what they were saying was that obviously pressure put on mothers also have a consequence for children. And the forms of conditional welfare that we're talking about here, so kind of activation and sanctions and individual responsibilization that are targeting adults, also affect children by proxy, because they are there, and how we deal with their parents will, of course, also affect the children. The mothers, they reported that their children were ill very often. This is also something that I observed, and that their behavior was affected, that their ability to put boundaries as parents and maintain routines was ruptured. If you live in a hotel where you have no cooking facilities, there's no space for children to run around or to play, that will, of course, have an impact on children's development and behavior. So very, very limited spaces. And unlike the findings from Malmö that Marcus was talking about, in my findings, unfortunately, many of these families were moving on a weekly basis. or sometimes even initially, before they were kind of accommodated in the system, it could be that for 2 or 3 weeks that they were on a daily basis, they were kind of reassessed if they could have support or not. So they had to kind of go back to the social service. This has then been criticized by the social service inspectorate in Stockholm, kind of saying that these kind of methods are not effective and they should not be used because they are not good for children, but they are also very time consuming for the social workers and the social service staff. So there's kind of no evidence really that they are methods that are based on any knowledge or have the impact desired. The mothers also spoke a lot about their own mental health, how that was affected, which they also saw as having a negative impact on their children. And really, as a conclusion, I would say that housing problems become translated or almost transformed into child welfare problems. And I want to maintain as well, there are other studies that have looked specifically at social assistance and single mothers. And that in Sweden, single mothers with a migrant background, which was, I forgot to say before, but all of my informants had a migrant background because they are so overrepresented within this population. But they are also less likely than other groups to have social kind of social conditions or kind of mental illness or addiction as an underlying issue and reason for why they are on social assistance. So it is more poverty related, which is what Marcus also was talking about before. So poverty kind of related issues then are translated into child welfare problems, and mothers who initially were not seen as kind of failing in their parenting, gradually as this was going on, they were started to be questioned in their capacity as parents because they were not seen as taking responsibility for the housing. And I think, you know, it is very concerning to see that this is the kind of lack really of knowledge and methods and the kind of, I would say, the organically growing or kind of responding to a need that is there, but that we don't really have the tools to address, is then being transformed into this. Marcus, you can, yeah. I don't know, do you want to take this one, Marcus, or should we take it together? Okay, so some of the issues that we together have identified that kind of needs further attention really in Sweden, it is this issue about accountability. You know, who is actually responsible for the support that homeless families are in need of? And makes me think of the poem that Marcus was quoting in the beginning, when people are not able to carry their shadow, what is our responsibility as a society, and who should take that, you know, who should be accountable for that? The methods used, they need to be more based on knowledge. There's a lot of research that shows that a lot of the methods that are being used currently in Sweden are counterproductive, and they are creating further problems for these families and for children. And that is something that really needs to be looked into and addressed. Children's rights are not visible when social services are working under those kind of conditions, really. And then there is also the issue of vulnerable groups. So that kind of comes back to the definitions and the categorizations that Marcus was talking about. We've seen how this distinction between structurally homeless and socially homeless, we are recognizing that it's a structural problem, but we are seeking individual solutions or individual blame for this structural problem in the methods that we apply. But this also has to do with, with how how the Social Service Act that was written quite a long time ago has defined vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups are the kind of traditional social service groups. But vulnerability from a research perspective is much broader than that. Marcus, do you want to, I can see that you want to, do you want to add something there? No? So, you know, the vulnerability of children, for example, is not really doesn't become included in the definition when we only look at the adult and the adult's situation and the adult's responsibility. And this kind of contradiction is also an issue that really needs further attention. Thank you.